It was the summer of 1944. The war had raged across continents for 5 long, merciless years. In the rolling fields of rural Georgia, hidden behind barbed wire and watchtowers, a group of German women found themselves far from home. Captured soldiers, torn from the familiar streets and villages of their youth, thrust into a strange land whose language, customs, and rhythms were foreign to them. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the neatly organized POW camp. Dust rose from the dirt paths as guards patrolled with measured steps, and the distant clang of mess hall trays echoed faintly, hinting at the day's ritual yet to unfold. Inside the camp, the mess hall doors swung open, revealing a world they could hardly have imagined. Rows of long wooden tables stretched endlessly, each surface overflowing with steaming food. Mashed potatoes glistened with butter, golden loaves of bread awaited eager hands, and platters of meat, roast beef, chicken, pork, sat proudly, each slice perfectly portioned. Vegetables glistened with sheen and color, sauces shimmered in the soft afternoon light, and desserts, pies, cakes, and puddings, waited temptingly at the end of each table. The air was thick with the comforting aroma of warmth, abundance, and civilization itself. The women stepped inside cautiously, eyes wide, fingers trembling as they clutched their bowls and trays. Shock rippled across their faces. The portions were unlike anything they had ever seen in the bread lines. The first trays were laid before them, and the women froze, their hands hovering uncertainly over the smooth wooden surfaces as though afraid to touch what they saw. The mess hall, though familiar in its basic structure, long tables, benches, and neatly arranged trays, was transformed by the sheer presence of food. Each table gleamed under the soft afternoon light streaming through tall windows, the polished wood reflecting the steam rising from the trays in a hazy, almost ethereal glow. The aroma was immediate and overwhelming, the earthy richness of butter melting into creamy mashed potatoes, the roasted, savory scent of meats browned to perfection, and the delicate fragrance of fresh vegetables, still vibrant in color despite the harsh rationing that had defined their lives for so long. The women, used to a wartime existence defined by scarcity, rationing, and constant uncertainty, stared in disbelief at what seemed like a cornucopia, a banquet that defied logic and expectation. Their eyes moved along the trays as though trying to memorize each detail. Potatoes, sculpted into smooth, rounded mounds, glistened under the soft light, the pale cream dotted with pools of golden melted butter. Beside them, gravy shimmered as it settled into the shallow valleys of the mashed mountains, thick and warm, inviting and utterly indulgent. The meat, beef, chicken, pork, lay roasted and tender, the edges browned perfectly, the juices pooling just enough to promise richness in every bite. Vegetables were arranged in neat bundles, their colors bright, vibrant green beans glistening as if polished, carrots roasted to a soft orange brilliance, and corn kernels shining like tiny golden beads. Bread rolls, perfectly round, puffed and golden, seemed to invite a touch, a squeeze, a taste. Their very existence seemed almost obscene to women who had endured long, lean months where even a simple slice of bread was a luxury. And desserts, pies, cakes, and custards sat at the ends of the tables like jewels, tempting in their simplicity, yet luxurious in their abundance, icing and crusts perfectly formed, glistening under the glow of the afternoon sun. The women's hands trembled as they reached forward. Fingers brushed trays and recoiled almost immediately, as if the abundance were too fragile, too precious, too impossible to be real. Some clutched their bowls tightly, knuckles whitening, while others simply let their hands hover mid-air, unable to act, paralyzed by shock. Their eyes darted from one tray to another, wide and searching, almost as if they were trying to find some hidden flaw, some catch in the illusion. But there was none. Everything was real: the weight of the plates, the warmth of the steam, the tantalizing smell of food that was rich, generous, and unapologetically abundant. This was not a portion for survival. It was a portion for enjoyment, for satisfaction, for the simple, unspoken joy of being fed well. Memories from back home clashed sharply with the present. They remembered thin soup ladled from enormous cauldrons, rationed bread barely enough to fill an empty stomach, potatoes scraped from hard soil, and the lingering ache of hunger that had defined their young adult lives in the shadow of total war. There had been no butter, no rich sauces, no meat that glistened and invited indulgence. Vegetables were pale, bland, often overcooked or dried. Desserts were virtually non-existent, a single small piece of chocolate, a thin slice of stale cake. These had been the rare treasures that they had learned to savor with reverent silence. And yet here, in a world so alien and yet so meticulously ordered, every detail screamed of care, precision, and abundance. The contrast was dizzying, almost painful. As they began to grasp the trays, each movement was tentative, almost ceremonial. One woman extended a hand toward a mound of mashed potatoes, her fingers shaking, and finally scooped a small portion into her bowl. She paused, breath held, eyes wide, as if she had dared not believe what she had done. Another reached for a slice of roast beef, turning it over in her hands as though confirming its solidity, its reality. The food was warm, it was real, and yet it was more than nourishment. It was a statement, a declaration that even prisoners, even enemies, could be treated with dignity and respect, that in the midst of a brutal global conflict, small acts of human kindness could still exist. The women's expressions shifted subtly as their shock began to mingle with wonder. Their lips parted slightly, eyebrows raised, eyes darting from tray to tray as if trying to absorb every detail in a single glance. They began to whisper to one another, quiet murmurs of disbelief, words of astonishment that carried little accusation and more curiosity, tinged with awe. They spoke of the size of the portions, the richness of the dishes, the incredible attention to detail. Look at this bread, it's soft golden. The meat, it's roasted perfectly. I've never seen so many vegetables at once. Each phrase carried a weight of longing and surprise, a mix of incredulity and something close to joy. Even as their shock persisted, a strange rhythm began to emerge. They learned almost instinctively how to navigate the trays without waste, how to approach the abundance with care, and how to preserve the dignity of the moment. One woman gently lifted a slice of meat onto her bowl, careful not to spill gravy. Another nudged a roll toward a fellow prisoner with a quiet smile. There was no chaos, no scramble, just a careful, almost reverent interaction with the food that had so startled them. It was as if the enormity of the meal demanded a new form of etiquette, a silent agreement that the abundance deserved respect, even amidst the uncertainty and fear that otherwise governed their lives. For a moment, the war seemed to shrink beyond the barbed wire walls, beyond the distant sounds of artillery, beyond the fear of what might come next. For a moment, these women, captured, displaced, and surrounded by foreign guards, were allowed to exist simply as humans, responding to warmth, comfort, and the joy of sustenance. The mess hall, filled with sunlight and the scent of cooked food, became a kind of sanctuary, a space where disbelief gave way to amazement, where scarcity was replaced by abundance, and where the women were reminded, however fleetingly, of life as it could be generous, nurturing, and tender, even in a world at war. Each glance, each hesitant movement, each tremulous reach for a fork or spoon was imbued with layers of meaning, gratitude, astonishment, disbelief, and a cautious hope that somewhere within the walls of the camp, kindness had found its way into their daily existence. And in this silent ballad of discovery, of hands moving carefully over warm trays, of eyes wide with wonder, the German women were learning something unexpected, that even in captivity, even as the world burned around them, moments of human generosity and care could pierce through the chaos, leaving them stunned, humbled, and, in ways they had long forgotten, almost entirely human again. As the women found their seats along the long wooden tables, the sense of astonishment that had begun when they first glimpsed the trays now deepened, growing heavier, almost tangible in the quiet hum of the mess hall. Each step toward the benches was measured, tentative, as though approaching an unknown world where every object demanded careful scrutiny. Their eyes swept the room repeatedly, absorbing every detail of the feast before them. Rows of steaming dishes, gleaming utensils, and polished wooden surfaces that seemed impossibly smooth and orderly. For a moment, The scale of it all was overwhelming. The sheer size of the portions, the richness of the preparations, the deliberate care that had gone into arranging each plate as if the women were not prisoners, but honored guests. They exchanged furtive glances, lips slightly parted, fingers clenching and unclenching, as though trying to reconcile the disparity between their memories of war and the reality in front of them. The first sounds of movement were soft, almost reverent. The gentle scrape of bowls against trays, the quiet clatter of utensils, the occasional whisper carried from one side of the table to another. Some women pressed their hands to their mouths, as if in disbelief, while others simply sat, frozen in a state of awe, their eyes wide, reflecting the golden light that streamed through the windows. The food itself seemed to radiate warmth beyond the simple comfort of heat. Mashed potatoes, rich with butter and gravy, glistened like molten gold. Slices of meat perfectly roasted revealed tender, succulent interiors that promised flavor beyond mere sustenance. Vegetables, carefully prepared, retained their bright colors, a small rebellion against the gray monotony of rationed wartime meals. Bread rolls, plump and golden, invited hesitant hands, while pies and custards sat at the ends of tables like treasures waiting to be discovered, their delicate crusts and creamy fillings impossible to resist. Each element of the meal was familiar yet foreign, ordinary yet almost ceremonially luxurious, striking the women with a mix of incredulity and fascination. Quiet murmurs began to ripple through the group, small, almost imperceptible at first, then growing in confidence. "Eats so much," one whispered, the words trembling on her lips. Another shook her head slowly, as if denying the evidence of her eyes. "I've never seen anything like this," came another murmur, barely audible, yet filled with astonishment. There was a rhythm to their reactions, a silent choreography of wonder. Some reached cautiously for bread rolls, turning them over in their hands, feeling the warmth, marveling at their softness. Others dipped their spoons into the mounds of potatoes or scooped generous portions of meat onto their plates, each gesture measured, hesitant, almost ceremonial. They were not merely eating. They were discovering, processing, negotiating with the unfamiliar abundance that surrounded them. The more they explored the trays, the more their disbelief evolved into a kind of quiet fascination. Each bite they dared to take became a revelation, a small act of wonder. Butter melted instantly on the tongue, gravy carried the rich depth of flavor that seemed impossible for a wartime mess hall, and each vegetable retained a brightness, a freshness that spoke of careful preparation and attention. The women's eyes often darted to one another, seeking confirmation, sharing unspoken questions. Is this real? Are we allowed this? Could this exist even in the midst of war? There was an almost imperceptible laugh that passed from one to another, a soft exhale of relief and astonishment that mingled with the scent of roasted meats and steaming vegetables. In this moment, the hall was transformed from a place of captivity into a stage for discovery, a room where the simple act of eating became a profound encounter with humanity. Conversation slowly grew, tentative at first, then more confident, forming around small observations. "The meat, it tastes different," one woman murmured, eyes wide, savoring a morsel that melted in her mouth. "And the bread, it's soft, warm," another added, nodding. "The vegetables, they're not overcooked, they're perfect." These simple statements were laden with astonishment, small triumphs of recognition in a world that had so often denied them comfort. Each word, each movement, carried a mix of relief and disbelief, a reconciliation of expectation and reality that felt almost sacred. Their eyes often flicked to the ends of the tables, where desserts glimmered, the smooth custards and flaky crusts promising a sweetness that was foreign, yet inviting. Some dared to take a small portion, lifting it slowly, examining it before finally taking a bite, their reactions a mix of shock, delight, and something near reverence. Even the most cautious of the women could not ignore the abundance surrounding them. One woman, whose hands had initially hovered tensely over her tray, finally reached for a generous slice of meatloaf, the richness of its aroma drawing her in. Her eyes widened further as she tasted it, the flavor deep and comforting, the warmth of the dish spreading through her like a forgotten memory of home. Another reached for a piece of bread, breaking it carefully, savoring its softness and sweetness, almost as though committing the moment to memory. Every motion, every small indulgence, carried the weight of a world she had once known, now rendered accessible in fragments through the extraordinary generosity of the American kitchen. The women began to notice small details that spoke volumes about the care taken in preparation. Gravy was ladled with precision, never spilling onto the table. Vegetables were arranged in neat, harmonious bundles. Each slice of meat was cooked to uniform perfection, neither dry nor underdone. Even the smallest touches, the curl of a pie crust, the gentle sheen on a mound of potatoes, the way light glinted off a knife or spoon, seemed to amplify the sense of luxury. It was not extravagance for show, it was an insistence on dignity, an affirmation that even those captured and displaced deserved more than mere sustenance. It was a quiet lesson in humanity delivered not with words, but through the careful preparation and presentation of food. As the women continued, the mess hall's atmosphere shifted subtly. What had begun as disbelief became tentative exploration, then cautious enjoyment. There was laughter now, quiet at first, soft and hesitant, then more audible, a shared acknowledgement that the world outside these walls, harsh, unforgiving, and violent, had a hidden counterpart, one of warmth, care, and generosity. Eyes that had once been wary now sparkled with the thrill of the unfamiliar, the simple joy of experiencing something completely unexpected. Conversations bubbled quietly beneath the din of movement, whispers of astonishment punctuated by sighs of delight as plates were filled, emptied, and filled again. In this delicate balance of awe and indulgence, by the time the women began to eat in earnest, the initial shock that had frozen them at the threshold of the mess hall had gradually transformed into quiet fascination. The trembling of hands and the hesitant glances exchanged moments before had given way to measured exploration, the small acts of taking bread rolls, scooping potatoes, and lifting morsels of meat becoming deliberate, almost reverential gestures. Each bite was a revelation, a private discovery of a world that seemed at once familiar and impossibly distant. The warmth of the food spread slowly, not only through their bodies but into their very consciousness, softening the edges of fear and displacement that had come to define their daily existence in captivity. There was something almost sacred in these movements, a quiet acknowledgement that each bite was more than mere sustenance. It was proof that care could exist even in the midst of conflict, that humanity could persist in the unlikeliest of places. Some women ate in silence, eyes lowered to their plates, as if performing a ritual of gratitude, savoring each mouthful with meticulous attention. Others dared to share observations in hushed tones, soft exclamations escaping them like whispered secrets. "It tastes real," one murmured, eyes wide, as if the act of speaking the words aloud could somehow solidify the reality of what she was experiencing. Another responded with a small nod, "And warm. I didn't expect it to be warm." It was remarkable to consider that the warmth of a simple meal could carry with it such significance, and yet for these prisoners it was transformative. Every flavor, every texture, every carefully measured portion seemed to speak directly to them, a quiet reassurance that life, even in the form of a meal, could hold dignity and comfort. The act of eating, simple on its surface, became a complex and layered experience, intertwining memory, longing, awe, and relief into each motion. The mess hall, now alive with the gentle sounds of movement and quiet conversation, seemed to breathe with the women's reactions. The clatter of utensils, the soft scraping of bowls across trays, and the occasional sigh of delight mingled with the lingering scent of roasted meats and freshly baked bread. There was a rhythm to the room, a cadence that reflected the careful exploration of abundance by women who had been trained for scarcity, whose bodies and minds had long been accustomed to the rationed, the small, and the insufficient. Each movement was deliberate, a negotiation between caution and desire, disbelief and pleasure. Even the most reserved among them could not resist the richness before them. One woman, after several hesitant glances, finally lifted a generous forkful of meat to her lips, the warmth and tenderness of the bite eliciting a quiet, involuntary gasp of surprise. As the women continued to navigate the enormous portions, laughter began to surface. It was soft at first, tentative, almost shy, a fragile sound that tested the boundaries of this new experience. One woman quietly chuckled as she struggled to balance her tray, full to overflowing with food that seemed far too generous for any single person. Another joined, her smile revealing both disbelief and delight at the absurdity of abundance in a world defined by deprivation. These small moments of shared humor began to stitch connections between the prisoners, a quiet camaraderie emerging from the collective astonishment. The walls of the mess hall, once stark and imposing, seemed to recede in importance, replaced by an atmosphere defined not by captivity, but by the shared human experience of encountering unexpected generosity. The women also began to notice subtleties in the food that further deepened their sense of wonder. The mashed potatoes were not only abundant, but creamy, smooth, and seasoned with a richness that spoke of careful preparation. Gravy, poured in just the right measure, coated each spoonful with a comforting warmth that seemed almost luxurious. The vegetables retained their integrity, their colors vibrant, their textures crisp yet tender, offering a contrast that delighted the senses. The meat was cooked to perfection, tender, juicy, and full of flavor, not dry or overcooked as they had often endured in previous meals. Even the desserts at the ends of the tables, pies with flaky crusts and cakes adorned with delicate frosting, seemed designed to tempt and reassure, to remind the women that pleasure could still exist, even amid the harsh realities of war. Conversation began to grow more confident, with the women daring to articulate the wonder they were feeling. "It's more than I imagined," one said softly, her fork poised mid-air, eyes sparkling with disbelief. Another added, "I never thought I would see food like this again, not in my lifetime." Their voices were filled with astonishment, but also with a subtle undercurrent of gratitude, a recognition that these meals were more than mere nutrition. They were a gesture of care, of humanity, extended to those who had so often been denied it. Each small observation reinforced the shared understanding that abundance, thought lost to the realities of war, could exist even here, inside the barbed wire, inside the confinement of captivity. As they continued to eat, the women's reactions became more nuanced. Some paused to savor each bite slowly, eyes closing briefly to fully experience the warmth and flavor. Others exchanged glances of pure astonishment, silently communicating the impossibility of what they were witnessing. The largest portions, once intimidating, became a source of wonder and delight as the women realized that nothing would be withheld from them, that they could, at least in this moment, indulge freely without fear or restriction. This freedom, however small, carried immense emotional weight. It was a quiet assertion that, even in captivity, one could experience dignity, care, and even joy, however fleeting or fragile. The role of the guards, ever present yet unobtrusive, added a layer of complexity to the scene. Their quiet observation served as a reminder that these women were still prisoners, yet their presence was tempered by restraint, by an unspoken understanding that these meals were not merely sustenance, but also an exercise in humanity. The women, in turn, responded with a mix of caution and gratitude, aware that each bite was both a gift and a delicate negotiation with authority. In this delicate balance, the whole became a space where the boundaries of captivity blurred, where moments of comfort and dignity could exist alongside the rigid structures of control and confinement. Over time, as the initial astonishment mellowed into quiet enjoyment, the mess hall took on a rhythm of its own. Plates were filled and emptied, trays carefully handled, and conversations grew interwoven with soft laughter and gentle exclamations of surprise. The women began to recognize patterns in the abundance, the meticulous arrangement of food, the attention to detail, the careful seasoning, and the warmth that seemed to emanate from every dish. This attention to detail did more than nourish their bodies, it nourished their spirits, offering a rare reminder that care and thoughtfulness could survive even in a world dominated by war, scarcity, and fear. By the end of the meal, the women had navigated the vast expanse of food with a mixture of curiosity, delight, and awe. Their initial shock had transformed into a profound appreciation for the generosity and human kindness implicit in the preparation and presentation of the dishes. Hands no longer trembled as they reached for bread rolls or scooped potatoes. Eyes no longer darted in disbelief, but lingered in quiet reflection, absorbing the colors, the textures, the warmth, and the care evident in every tray. The act of eating, simple yet profound, had become a vehicle for human connection, a testament to the enduring capacity for empathy and generosity, even in the harshest of circumstances. As the women rose from the tables, trays emptied or nearly emptied, the mess hall remained filled with the faint scent of cooked food and the lingering aura of astonishment and delight. There was a new confidence in their movements, a quiet sense of satisfaction, and an awareness that, for a fleeting moment, the war outside these walls had been suspended. In its place existed a room of warmth, care, and human generosity, a space where the simplest act of nourishment had become transformative. The women had discovered that even in captivity, moments of joy, comfort, and dignity could exist, carried not only on the plates before them, but in the shared experience of astonishment and wonder that united them in that extraordinary, unforgettable meal.